morning, everyone, or hello, everyone. Welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar, and thank you for joining us. And a big thank you to our sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and enabling us to put on this event each week. Today, we are joined by Mr. John Bradford, who will be presenting on Japan as a maritime nation. Mr. Bradford is the Executive Director and Founding President of the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies, which is known as YCAPS. He's concurrently a Senior Fellow in the Maritime Security Program, S. Rajanatnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He previously served as a Navy officer for 23 years. His at-sea assignments included Deputy Director, Maritime Headquarters, U.S. 7th Fleet, Regional Cooperation Coordinator, U.S. 7th Fleet, and Commanding Officer, USS Stetham. In the Pentagon, he served as a Country Director for Japan in the Office of the Security Defense Policy and Asia-Pacific Political Military Branch Chief on the Navy staff. As an Olmsted Scholar, he studied in the Department of Political Science at Gajah Mada University in Indonesia and completed the MSc in Strategic Studies from the S. Rajanatnam School of International Studies in Singapore. He is also a graduate of Japan's National Institute of Defense Studies, U.S. National Defense University, U.S. Naval War College, and Cornell University. Mr. Bradford, it's a pleasure to have you today, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Amani. It's great to be here and see so many friends from the YCAPS community. I did make some slides, so let me start by trying to do my best to share them. There we go. Does that look good, everybody? Can I get a thumbs up? Okay, great. Double thumbs up from Jeff. It's always great and welcoming. So what I want to talk about today is Japan as a maritime power. I just kind of want to walk through the very basics of why Japan is a maritime nation. And if you were to evaluate nations as sea powers, what the elements of Japanese society and the Japanese economy and the Japanese nation qualify it for such. It's a little bit of history, a little bit of geography, a little bit of current affairs. Doesn't go super in depth because this is the Getting to Know Japan series. So I really just want to walk through the 101, and then maybe we can go a little more in depth in the Q&A. I can see in the audience many people who have a tremendous amount of expertise in this area. So I'm going to start with a quiz. So if people can play along and write the answer in the chat. My first question is, what nation is this? And please don't mind the Generation X graphics. Amani, do we have any answers yet?
Yes, Jeff said the UK. Asahi Koga said Japan. Vivian said Japan.
Okay, we have two correct answers, and I'm ashamed to say that the YCAP staff member was incorrect. And that is, it's Japan. Now, obviously, it doesn't look like Japan because this is Japan, including its exclusive economic zone. So this is a map of the world with some nice graphics of countries where it's showing both their land territories, their territorial seas, and their exclusive economic zone. Now, of course, it's a Mercator projection, so you can see the relative weight of different countries, but remember the countries around the equator actually a bit bigger than this projection would entail. So Japan's pretty big, not the biggest, but it's quite large. Also notice that there's this sort of keyhole shape in the center of it, the blue in the middle of this picture. And this is areas that Japan, so your exclusive economic zone reaches out to 300 nautical miles from land territories. So all of the small Japanese archipelagic islands that go out into the Pacific, into the Philippine Sea, the so-called second island chain, give it this big green area, but there's actually keyholes in the center of Japan's economic exclusive zone, which would be considered high seas or international waters. So what is a sea power? I'm going to go back to Alfred Thayer Mahan's classic definition, where he talks about what designates a country as a sea power versus a continental power. And he talks about things such as the nation's geographic position, its physical conformity, the extent of its territory, the size of its population, the character of its people, and the character of its government. And I'm not going to, as I talk about Japan, I'm not going to seek to evaluate Japan exactly vis-a-vis each of these six criteria, but I do think we're going to walk through some elements of Japan as a nation that sort of match up with these different categorizations and help you get a sense for it all. So first of all, just some numbers. Japan is the third largest country in the world by its GDP, with almost $5 trillion of a GDP. It's number 4 in exports and number 4 in imports. And note that those exports and imports are about 98% by sea. So a country's economy is very, very much dependent on maritime trade, trade being carried by surface ships to and from Japan. Its naval force is the world's 4th largest, depends how you count that, but here I'm counting it by tons. And so really a very large and capable Navy. Its coastline is the 6th longest of any country in the world, almost 30,000 kilometers. Its EEZ, exclusive economic zone that we just talked about, is the 8th largest in the world, over 4 million square kilometers. In terms of the number of islands which make up the nation, it's number 9. And in terms of all nations, the world, it's number 11. So as a nation, Japan is really, really big and important. As a maritime nation, it's also very big and very important. And then I'd also just call you to have a look at the map, and you can see that sort of blue area in the center, which is the area outside of its economic zone, exclusive economic zone, which is well within the sort of outline of Japan's maritime space. So it's a very strategic location. It's a large nation that's offshore of the Asian landmass. And in many ways, Japan controls access to the Pacific Ocean from the Asian landmass. So you can see here with these red lines, the various different straits that Russia, Korea, and China need to kind of get through in order to make their way out of the Philippine Sea and the open Pacific Ocean. Number 1 and 2 and 3 and 5, those are all lined up with the Japanese archipelago. So another way to look at it is from this projection, where you're looking out from Asia into the Pacific. And you can see that those sort of red arcs on the left are Japan. So if you're in Korea, or if you're in the northern half of China, or if you're in parts of maritime Russia, you look out and see Japan as the barrier between you and the Pacific. This gives it a very, very strategic location. But if we take this other projection, and you kind of put Japan at the south of the map, and you're in Japan and you say, okay, so I'm this country off the coast of Asia, but I'm a trading nation. And I have to send my goods that I produce, I have to send them to China. I have to send them to South Asia. I have to send them to Australia. I have to send them to Europe. And I have to get the materials to make those goods from the rest of the world. I have to get my petroleum from the Middle East. I have to get raw materials mostly from places like Africa and Australia. And if you notice here too, Japan is constrained by geography. If you look here, you can see that its maritime paths for its ships that come in to and from Japan, going out to much of the rest of the world, have to pass along the Asian coastline, and they have to make their way past Taiwan and past the Philippines and through the Southeast Asia archipelago. So this is a complex geography where Japan is at the center of maritime space for the region. Now, this is also a reason, there are many reasons, that Japan is such good friends with the United States. But notice that the Japan trade, the one space where it's not constrained is out into the open Pacific, where it can reach back to its friends and close ally, the United States, and also to Canada. So I think this geographic location is important to understand where Japan fits into the maritime world and why it is a keystone maritime state in the global trade dynamics as well as naval dynamics. Because Navy's one of their roles is to seek to control the ocean in order to manage trade and support national prosperity. So going back to history, Japan rose to power as an industrialized state, which was doing all of this trade. And then that sort of reached its first pinnacle before World War II. And during World War II, Japan was largely defeated during battles at sea, but it was also largely defeated because the United States was able to isolate it from trade, particularly from petroleum imports, but also from the food and other resources it wanted from the states it controlled in Southeast Asia, et cetera. So at the end of that devastation, you have a country which is reliant on the sea, but its maritime infrastructure has been highly damaged by bombing, and it's lost almost all of its shipping fleet. So this is the Yokosuka Council of Asia Pacific Studies. So I'm glad to have a picture of Yokosuka here. This is just as occupation began. This is, I believe, they're Australian, a survey party arriving in Port Yokosuka and seeing the damaged ships there and evaluating the infrastructure for the occupation. So Japan moves from there to Reconstruction. And during the Reconstruction era, Japan focuses on maritime industries first. I wouldn't say exclusively, but certainly first. Ship repair, getting its fleet back up, getting its ports ready, and getting people out on the water fishing were top priorities. The United States very much supported these. In fact, a lot of the maritime industries were put to work repairing the U.S. fleet. U.S. fleet ships that had been damaged during the war were brought to Japan, repaired, sailed back to the United States, and promptly decommissioned. And partially that was to make them safe to go across the world, but it was also to make sure that there was work and there was demand to get the port industries up and running again in Japan as we sought to reconstitute this newborn democracy as a friend of the United States. Quickly after the war, the Maritime Safety Board was created. This was an agency which was set up. It was quickly renamed the Maritime Safety Agency to get to work to make those seas around Japan safe and secure. It was very busy with demining. There were over 100,000 mines in the waters around Japan. These are mines that have been deployed by both Japan to defend itself from Allied invasion and also by the Allies to prevent Japan from using its own ports. 46 of those minesweepers were also deployed to Korea to assist in the demining around Korea to enable landings such as the Incheon landings. That Maritime Safety Agency is today's Japan Coast Guard. Japan Coast Guard is its English name. It continues to be called the Maritime Safety Agency in Japanese. In 1952, the Maritime Guard Force was created. It was kind of spun off from the Maritime Safety Agency, and this was a slightly more heavily armed portion of Japan's maritime forces. It was equipped with surplus U.S. frigates and landing ships from the World War II fleet. And in 1954, the Maritime Guard Force became the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, the force that we work with today alongside the U.S. Navy, that is responsible for maintaining Japan's sovereignty and its overseas security interests. And the JMSDF was originally established with hand-me-down equipment from the United States, but by 1956, only 11 years after the end of the war, it was already building its own destroyers to equip its own force. So the next phase of Japan's modern maritime history deals directly with the economic miracle. So the economic miracle of Japanese, the late 1950s through the 1980s of rapid growth was industrial based. And I think it's very important to note that one of those pieces of that puzzle of that industrial growth was shipping. It was shipbuilding and it was ship construction. This was both one of the drivers of the industry in terms of work and production at home, but it also enabled the trade of the other goods that other parts of the Japanese economy were making. So in 1960, 20% of all new ships in the world were built in Japan. And in 1970, Japan had the world's second largest merchant fleet with 1,500 ships. It became a major contributor to maritime safety and infrastructure. And to save my voice and to save you from having to hear from me for 30 minutes straight, I'm just going to play a short video highlighting some of this economic activity that took place in the period. All right. So I just want to point out that sort of an important transition point or inflection point, I should say, in this economic miracle was the oil shocks of 1973. The oil shocks put a lot of questions into the direction that Japan was going and whether or not that it could sustain this economic growth based on a domestic, purely on an economy, not purely, but on an economy that was dominated by domestic production, industrial production, and exports, and absent sort of the rest of the elements of a modern security and economic policy. Oh. So this is when you see Japan transitioning into sort of its modern maritime economy. So it still has the world's very large merchant fleet. But that is in terms of ownership rather than flagged. In the 1970s, most ships flew the Japanese flag. And Japan has since then realized that it's very convenient and very useful for its economic model to own ships. But the ships are often registered in another country. It's also one of the leading shipbuilders in the world. It's no longer stands alone as number one. It now competes with China and South Korea. Usually, if you kind of count the numbers, Japan in most years is number 2 or 3, rarely number 1 in shipbuilding. But it kind of depends on the demand from year to year, and it depends on the types of ship. Japan is very focused on the high-end vessels. So it builds the things like cruise ships and the liquefied petroleum gas and liquefied LNG type carriers, whereas South Korea and China will build the slightly lower end vessels. So when demand is up for high-end vessels or cruise ships, then Japan kind of sleeps up into number 2. And when demand for those vessels is down and more people are buying the sort of mass-produced lower tech ships, then China gets a larger edge and pulls ahead. But the Japanese modern maritime economy isn't just about buying and owning ships. It's about insurance, it's about finance, it's law, it's about technology, it's about ports. So this chart I have here shows the world's top 5 cities in terms that are considered the top 5 maritime hubs in the world. And Tokyo comes in number 5 among Singapore, Rotterdam, London, and Shanghai. So as I talked about the oil shocks, I don't want to overstate their importance and that they drove Japan to create a more modern military posture to support this shipping, but they were an important element of it. And you see a steady point from that point onward where the JMSDF goes from sort of a guard force that worries about inshore waters and supports the United States to a more global force, to what it is today, which is arguably, I would argue, the number 3 most important and powerful navy, a de facto navy in the world. So sort of milestones in that development. In 1981, when Ronald Reagan came to power and Ronald Reagan was pushing Japan and other allies to do more in as their share of the Cold War resistance to the Soviet Union, and Japan recognizes that it was more dependent on sea lanes, and it sees the U.S. as perhaps a bit less engaged in Asia than it had been during the Vietnam War. That transaction led Japan to announce that it would protect the sea lanes around Japan up to 1,000 nautical miles away. Now, why 1,000 nautical miles? That's not a precise figure, even though it was in the policy document. It's not exactly a map, and it's not exactly a clear circle around Japan. But if you draw a circle from Tokyo, 1,000 nautical miles, that basically gets you about to Guam, which is the closest U.S. naval base. It also gets you approximately to the Bashi Channel, the strait that's in between Taiwan and Luzon, which is the entryway into the South China Sea. So basically, Japan is saying to the United States and the world, we're going to pick up responsibility for making sure that trade flows and trade is defended from submarines in those final approaches from Japan going out to the United States and going out to Southeast Asia. It also gets very involved supporting the United States in the containment of Soviet submarines. You'll see a lot of Japanese aircraft and Japanese surface vessels sorting out of northern ports in places like Misawa, and tracking down those submarines as they seek to go to their bastions in the Northern Pacific, where they'd be able to fire nuclear weapons at the United States and allies. So it's driving ahead. And then in the tanker wars of the 1980s, one of the biggest targets of the weapons which are being fired by Iran and Iraq are Japanese ships. Yet Japan gets involved diplomatically, but it largely lets the United States be involved in the reflagging efforts and other defensive efforts to support shipping there in the Arabian Gulf, I should say. There was a big major effort at this time because one of the weapons that were being used against shipping was sea mines, and there was a big effort to get Japan to send its minesweeping force, which is probably the world's best, at least world's most capable, to support that, but Japan resisted. But after the first Gulf War in 1991, there was a big cleanup afterwards, including a lot of mines that needed to be cleaned up from those sea waters, and Japan did send its minesweepers. So this is the first overseas deployment of the JMSDF as a sort of military or as a defense force that would provide operations in support of friends and allies around the world. So 6 ships going and doing the demining mission. And I think this is an important threshold because from here you really see a rapid expansion in the JMSDF's capabilities and its operations. In 1993, it fields an Aegis destroyer. This is important because these were at the time, the world's most advanced naval ships. And it was the first US ally to field those vessels. It builds them in Japan with US technology. Since then, other countries have them, Australia, Spain, South Korea, but Japan was the first. And those ships became super handy because in the late 1990s, the North Korean missile threat is on the rise, and especially a very threshold crossing event was the firing of a Taepodong missile over Japan. At this point, Japan jumps all in to missile defense activities, and we realized together with the United States that Aegis vessels can be converted quite easily into becoming important missile defense assets. So in 2007, the Congo, which is one of those Japanese Aegis destroyers, completes its transformation into becoming a ballistic missile defense ship. And in 2015, the SM-32 Alpha missile is deployed. This is not the first interceptor missile. The SM-32 Alpha is one of the types of missiles. The interceptor missiles, the ones that are fired from ships into space to shoot down the ballistic missiles, which are flying through space to going towards a target. But this one is co-developed between the United States and Japan. Both Japan and the United States go into this project to use their latest technologies to develop the next generation missile together. And in 2015, when that missile's fielded, it's the most capable ballistic missile interceptor in the world. In parallel with these developments, Japan is getting more involved in defending the sea lanes from non-traditional threats, non-state threats, such as pirates and terrorists. And in 1999, the Japan Coast Guard gets a new mission, which is to go beyond guarding Japan's coast, but to guard Japan's sea lanes against terrorists and pirates abroad. Now, those waters further abroad tend to be inside the national territories and the sovereignty of other states. So it's not like the Japan Coast Guard is out on its own patrolling the waters. Instead, what it's doing is it's providing capacity building support to partners. It's helping them build up their capabilities so that they have more ability to protect the sea lanes that pass through their waters. So it's doing this with the Philippines, with Malaysia, with Indonesia, et cetera. And this eventually goes out into the Indian Ocean, where both the JMSDF and the Japan Coast Guard get involved in security operations from the 2000s forward. In 2001, during the US invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11, Japan sends ships to provide fuel to the US operations. So it sends oilers, but the oilers are protected by Japanese destroyers. In 2004, when the Indian Ocean tsunami devastates a big swath of India, Sri Lanka, and the western coasts of Indonesia and Thailand, the Japanese are very much involved in responding to that disaster, especially in Indonesia and Thailand. In 2009, when piracy problem in the Gulf of Aden, often referred to as the Somali piracy crisis, gets really hot. Japan is one of the first nations in Asia. It comes right after South Korea to deploy forces to the operations in that area to suppress piracy. And then eventually, 2 years later in 2011, Japan establishes its first overseas self-defense force base. This is in Djibouti. And this is an area where both primarily aircraft can fly out of there to do anti-piracy patrols, but it also assists the self-defense force ships in getting their logistics support. So today, the JMSDF and Japan Coast Guard are incredibly important, incredibly powerful, and incredibly capable forces. By John Bradford's reckoning, we can talk about where I get my tally from. I would say that the JMSDF is the world's third most powerful naval force, and the Japan Coast Guard is the world's second most powerful Coast Guard. The JMSDF is about 150 ships. This includes very high-end technology, some of the world's best submarines, the Aegis destroyers we talked about already. It already has F-35. Well, it has F-35. The Japanese self-defense forces have F-35 Bravo aircraft already, and soon there's going to be our embarking onboard flat deck destroyers, turning them into small aircraft carriers with some of the world's most advanced jets. But I think more importantly, if you just sort of count the numbers and you count the technology, you'll see that Japan is very, very good. But if you take a look, in addition to that, their training and their reliability, then that's why I sort of rank them number 3. I do point that it depends on the mission. They do not have the capabilities that the United States does to sail an aircraft carrier battle group around the world without other support. And it lacks abilities to conduct strike missions where its naval forces strike targets ashore. But under the new strategy, the new national security strategy that came out in December of last year, Japan is fully committed to developing those capabilities as well. And in terms of its Coast Guard, it's one of the world's largest. The Chinese Coast Guard is larger, but it's kind of number 2 in sort of number of ships. And again, very, very professional. And it does a very huge variety of missions. It provides security for fishermen and sailors and mariners using Japanese waters. It assists with the defense of Japanese sovereignty and administrative control around the contested Senkaku Islands. And as I mentioned before, it sends its forces out globally on capacity building and partnership missions. Those missions are focused in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, but they've been as far away as the Caribbean in smaller packages. So I don't want to leave it there, but at the same time, Amani told me to speak for 30 minutes, and we're at 30 minutes, so I'm going to stop. And I look forward to your questions and your discussion. While I'd be happy to have questions, I should even say that those of you experts want to pick me up on something, please do correct me. I'll clarify, or I'll just admit that I'm wrong, because I'm sure that when I speak for 30 minutes, I fumbled something here or there. Amani, back to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bradford. So in the chat, we had a lot of questions about like sea mines. For someone like me who's hearing about sea mines for the first time, I'm really curious. In regards to land mines, it doesn't take a lot of weight for it to like explode. So what would trigger a sea mine to go off, essentially?
Yeah, so sea mines have a variety of technology. So a traditional, or I don't know about traditional, when most people think of a sea mine, maybe some of you don't ever think of sea mines, but when a lot of us think about sea mines, the first thing we imagine are these like big steel balls with spikes on them. And the spikes are called horns. And the idea would be that if a ship bumped into it, it would push in that horn and then it would cause it to explode. So I think the first time I saw a sea mine like that, and it stuck in my brain, is there's an element of Gilligan's Island, where one of these sort of sea mines washes up on the coast, and then they all have to figure out, what they're going to do about it, and some antics that I don't remember follow on. So in their most basic form, and these were heavily used in World War II, they're really just like floating balls that if you bump into them, they blow up. So it's kind of like the old landmine that you step in. And because the ocean is so big, you have to deploy a lot of them. But the idea still is that you don't know where they are, you don't know where they might be. So just a small number of mines can block off a large area. But technology has evolved quite a bit since then. And rarely to today's mines require you to actually touch them. They're not impact-based. They can have magnetic sensors. So when a large piece of steel or iron gets near them, they explode. They can even have acoustic sensors where they're listening for the ship engine or propellers to be turning. And those obviously could be more sophisticated or less sophisticated. They might be listening for a certain type of propeller so that not just any ship will detonate them. And the other thing is, whereas mines in the past were either free floating or sort of tethered to the ground, so there's a chain that goes to the sea bottom and they stay in an area. Those still exist, but there's also missiles that are essentially, there's also mines which are essentially, imagine them like torpedoes that are resting, and when their sensors pick up a target acoustically or metallically or whatever, then they launch, and then they become like drones going through the ocean to attack their target. And that's why the technology has had to evolve and to keep pace to the evolving mines. Just to kind of wrap up what I'd said earlier, Japan's done a great job of developing the technology necessary to respond to that. And the technology side, it sort of rivals a lot of countries in Northern Europe who have a mine problem, in terms of what could take place in the Baltic Sea. But that's on the technology side. And in terms of just the number of vessels and the number of anti-mine specialist forces it has, it's very large. So that's sort of matches. Those are the elements which add up to give it the capability and the capacity I was talking about.
I see. So in South Korea, there's still an issue with like landmines that have not been recovered. Is there a similar issue with like sea mines? Because you mentioned about mine sweeping in Japan trying to account for these sea mines, but are there still some sea mines out there that haven't been accounted for?
Very, very few. There are, and every once in a while, one comes up. But they're World War II mines. So, you're now talking about something that's 70 years old, that's had to last in the water for that long. Japan was very aggressive in finding them and safing areas. So while I'm sure there's still a mine out there, it's not something that mariners have to worry about today in East Asia.
I see. So we have a question from H. Kawamura. This person asked, how long did it take to demine the sea around Japan? Because they have learned about the post-war reconstruction, but not about maritime demining.
I don't have a specific answer for that. I do know that the Maritime Safety Agency was very, very engaged with that for about 5 years.
I see. So the next question comes from Peter Darling. This person asked, was the Japanese self-defense force already thinking about missile defense when they originally procured the Congo class? And was this missile defense already understood as a latent compatibility back in the early 90s?
That's a difficult question to answer because, has someone thought about it or someone imagined that it could be? I'm sure the answer is yes. But I think the more important point is, Japan did not primarily buy Aegis destroyers with the idea that, in the future, North Korea is going to develop what missiles, and we want to be ahead of that. And this may be a nascent capability that could be transformed into a missile defense force. There's probably a visionary out there that had that idea. But the real goal was to provide air defense for JMSDF units in a potential conflict with the Soviet Union. Aegis destroyers, although they have a ballistic missile defense capability, the reason they were developed is because in the late Cold War, there was a belief, well, there was an assessment, I should say, that one of the Soviet tactics was to send up bombers with long-range missiles and attack naval forces, especially carrier strike groups, with a large number of these bomber-launched air-to-surface missiles. And so the Aegis destroyer's job was to protect the aircraft carrier, the high-value assets, from that missile attack. And so in the U.S. vision, that's all about protecting the aircraft carrier that would then be able to provide strike operations. But in the Japanese concept, that was actually more about, as I understand it, protecting the surface force from the air attack, so the surface force could defend Japanese waters from submarines and other threats. So a little bit different from the United States, but similar. The idea was not to develop a ship to defend yourself from North Korean missiles. It was the idea to get ships to defend the rest of your fleet from air attack.
That's really interesting. So does that fall in line essentially with Japan trying to follow the rules of the Constitution as far as like just providing, protection for itself, but not so much being like defensive?
Yeah, I mean, I think interpretations of Article 9 and limitations on what the SDF should procure or plan for and how they should operate have evolved over the years. That's a different getting to know Japan lecture. But in that trajectory of how those things evolved, that lines up very closely with what the Maritime Self-Defense Forces was doing. Right? So the Maritime Self-Defense Forces in the 60s and 70s was very coastal based. And then in the 1980s, ventures a little bit further out and starts doing this 1,000 nautical mile sea lanes thing, and picks up, rapidly expands into the mission to assist with the containment and control of Soviet submarines. And then it gets more advanced technology and becomes more of a pure player in the alliance system, used in the late Cold War and beyond.
I see. So could you also speak about Japan's submarine fleet and its capabilities? This was a question by David Potter.
Yeah, I mean, the Japanese submarine fleet is very capable. It's relatively large, and their forces have a great amount of capability. The subs are focused on anti-submarine warfare. So their primary mission is to look for and hunt other submarines, and then also to hunt surface ships. They're relatively long range. If you can see that submarines that Japan has are very tailored for the Japanese mission. They're diesel operated. But if you compare them to a lot of like European or even Korean diesel submarines, they're capable of longer ranges and sustain longer operations, because Japan has such a large sea territory, as we already saw. It has a lot of area to cover, to close off. It has two missions. One, it's going to want to, in a conflict, it's going to want to prevent hostile states from passing through its archipelago, but it's also going to want to make sure those sea lanes that are further abroad are open to bring trade into Japan. So therefore, it needs a longer range submarine than, say, like a Northern European submarine. They're also using, they do an iterative thing where inside a class of submarines, each submarine is slightly better than the other one. They don't sort of build a bunch of the exact same and then take 10 years to think about it and then develop another class. It's an iteration. They build out one submarine a year, and each submarine that they build is slightly better than the last one. One of the biggest technologies they've just added is lithium-ion batteries to the submarines. And those are really important because the way a diesel submarine works, it has a diesel engine, just like a truck. And that diesel engine can provide propulsion, but mostly what it's doing is it's providing, it's not tied in to the propulsion system. What it's doing is it's creating electricity that goes into a battery. And when the ship is running the diesel, it's got two problems. One, the diesel is noisy, and the other one, a diesel requires air. So that's a limitation on the submarine. So what it wants to do is it wants to run its diesels as quickly as possible, make as much power as possible, and then put it into batteries. And then once it's operating in batteries, it's much quieter. And so this new battery technology is allowing those battery operations to go longer and use more power, which gives it more speed and other capabilities. So they're great subs.
That's really fascinating. So are the submarines in this way, do you think, like, because you mentioned about like ships in regards to like how Japan compares to other countries when it comes to shipbuilding, do you think Japan is high ranking when it comes to like the type of technology they have for submarines?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the JMSDF's technology is among the world's best. It has access to the very top end US technology, such as Aegis, and it develops some of its own great stuff. The submarines I just talked about are one of the world's best classes. And I was just on board last week, visiting here in Singapore, a Mogami class frigate. New frigates being built in Nagasaki. There's one in Yokosuka. And they're also very capable, very high-end ships built with Japanese technology. So that's the main reason I would rate the JMSDF so highly. It is actually just a really big naval force, but it also fields some of the world's best technology. And the sailors on board are absolutely top-notch.
Very cool. So another question we have, going back to talking about sea mines. So Jeff asked, are there issues with weathering and mines floating off into uncharted areas over time, and if forces are responsible and chartering where the mines were used?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's not a problem with that in East Asia today. But I mean, this is essentially what the Japanese were doing after 1991, is to prevent an amphibious attack on Kuwait. The Iraqis had put a lot of sea mines out into the Arabian Sea, and the Japanese were there to join the international coalition that was tracking down and finding those mines. In theory, countries should exercise control and know where they put all the mines. That's actually in their best interest too. If they were to be the victors in the war, they would want to know where those mines were. But not every country keeps the best records. And in fact, if you think through various scenarios, some countries might be most interested in just dumping a lot of mines out there and worried about the quantity rather than spending a lot of energy and staff power tracking the mines and figuring out where they're going to be. This is kind of a concern in the Korean scenario, in the North Korean scenario, that North Korea has a great deal of mine capability, and it may put a lot of mines out into the water to prevent, if the war in Korea were to go hot and people were to start killing each other again, North Korea might put a lot of mines out, and obviously those would immediately drift into Japanese waters.
So, in your opinion, or in your experience, have you seen issues where the work of the JMSDF and the JCG have clashed? This is a question by Mark Christensen.
No, I have not actually seen them clash. This is actually a field that I study rather carefully. And, in the past 20 years ago, there was some degree of rivalry. And so, if you were sitting inside Tokyo and you wanted to see, did Ichigaya and Kasumigaseki compete or clash with each other? In the bureaucratic fights of Tokyo, there was a limited amount of that. And what that translated to in those eras, what wasn't so great, was units at sea that may not exactly cooperate as best as possible, which means there's a lack of synergy, a lack of combined effort. But they weren't clashing. They were still on the same team, which is Team Japan. And I'd say in recent years, in the last decade, but really especially in the last 5 years, they've increasingly worked together. You can see, just to give an example of this, Japan issues every few years, since 2007, a basic plan for ocean policy. The third of those plans was issued in 2018, and the fourth of those plans was issued on the 28th of April, so 2 weeks ago this year. And in the third plan, the one from 2018, the Coast Guard and the Japan Coast Guard and the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force are tasked to continue working together which at that point they already were working together increasingly. The new plan goes a step beyond that, and it tasks them to not just continue information sharing and coordination, but it tasks them to rehearse the procedures under which, in a war, the Japan Coast Guard would fall under the operational control of the Ministry of Defense, and it tasks the Japan Coast Guard to exercise contingency plans. So these are the national defense plans that the Japanese Ministry of Defense and other agencies write to defend Japan, or in case of a large-scale contingency, such as a war, open conflict. So, I mean, I guess if I could kind of restate all of that long answer in just a couple sentences, there has been some competition between the Japan Coast Guard and the JMSDF in the past, but I would characterize that as competition rather than conflict. And in recent years, I think they're working much more closely together. And I think the relationship is actually pretty good.
So do you have any thoughts on the HADR disaster response that Japan has provided during various times? This is a question by Ed Thompson.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the first missions that the Japanese Self-Defense Force got involved with overseas. And I think it does a lot for Japan. I think it does a lot for the services. But more importantly, they've rendered great aid to regions in distress. So I mentioned earlier the 2004 tsunami. The fact that Japan deployed its ships to the area made a difference. The fact that it was involved was certainly welcomed in the region and certainly helped people. At the same time, what militaries do in HADR situations is most important in the first few days. It's most important in that using their surveillance and reconnaissance assets to figure out where the damage is, figure out what infrastructure survives and can be used and what can't, and delivering those very first rounds of supplies, particularly water, but also food and medicine. And a lot of that really happens in the first 48 hours or the first week. In that case, the United States had an aircraft carrier in Hong Kong, and the aircraft carrier got underway and went there. It was the Abraham Lincoln. The JMSDF vessels were a little bit smaller and took a little bit more time to go there, so much of the work had already been done. So while they were valued, they weren't necessarily the most critical players. Now, that said, Japan has a larger disaster response capability, much of that resident inside the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, and Japan was one of the most important players in that response, even if the self-defense forces were not among the number 1 and 2 most important. Japan was, especially in a coordination role. JICA did a very important role in coordinating international response and delivering supplies. But if you take that forward, Japan's only built on that and become more valuable. So years later, 2009, if I correct, or 10, in the Haiti earthquake, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force and the other services, the ground and air self-defense forces, sent very quickly forces all the way around the world to the other side to Haiti. And then obviously, they were very, very involved in 2011 after Japan's triple disaster, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, and worked very closely with the U.S. forces then. And then I just want to highlight the last kind of milestone that I think is really important is that shortly thereafter, when the Philippines was destroyed, I shouldn't say destroyed, but took tremendous damage from Super Typhoon Haiyan, the JMSDF and the U.S. Navy deployed together. And while it wasn't officially a joint operation, the Japan and the U.S. both sailed there from ports in Japan. They exchanged liaison officers, and they worked very, very closely to deliver their aid in that operation. And many of those individuals including the flag officers in charge and also the liaison officers, were veterans of Operation Tomodachi and the 3/11 response. So therefore, they were already very comfortable working together. And I think this is a trend which is going to continue. So, where that comes back to is, while the self-defense forces are gathering combat capabilities at a pace that far exceeds past developments, they remain very capable at their Peace People Japan missions, such as disaster response in Japan and abroad.
So, Mr. Bradford, now I want to shift to China because you have quite a few questions with regards to China. Christoph Waldersee asked, when comparing Chinese and Japanese maritime forces altogether, China looks impressive, but what about their level of training? Because according to what I heard, Chinese armed forces lack power because of poor training and a weak command structure. So what is your opinion about this?
Yeah, my opinion is just an opinion. I haven't spent time embedded in the Chinese military, unlike I have spent time embedded in the Japanese self-defense forces. But I think the question implies the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is that China's military is very big. Its Navy is very big. If you look at the baseline capabilities, it has some of the world's best technology. It fields technology that's equivalent or on par with Aegis and other things. But it doesn't necessarily have a lot of depth. While it may have some frontline units, a lot of its service is still legacy older craft. That's rapidly changing, but it's still sort of the case. And then there's a belief, and I think it's not just made up. It's just not made up. It is based on assessments of reasonable people and experts that its level of training and competence and communications has not reached the same level as the United States or Japan or their European partners. That said, we don't know that, right? If you just take a look at the war in Ukraine, in comparison to what those experts expected, Ukraine has overperformed and Russia has underperformed. So to some extent, you don't really know what a military is made out of. It's really hard to see what their level of training is and their resiliency and the capabilities of their command and control until it's forced in combat. So I think that the question, does assess what most people think. I have no specific reasons to disagree with any of that, but we'll have to see to believe, or to see to know, I should say.
Are there any things that about the Chinese forces that jumps out to you as far as like how competitive that they are? Like how would you describe how competitive Chinese forces look? This is a question by Jin Narui.
I think that the main point I would make there is that in recent years in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, China has been willing to take risks with its forces, which for the most part have been well calculated and that they've served to improve their position. So, for example, when there's a conflict or a crisis, there's something like a collision or a standoff, China has been very aggressive in those cases. And if you kind of compare it to a poker game, it's been willing to take a little bit more risk, be a bit more gutsy, and it kind of comes out on top. Now, I think the Japan and the Philippines, their friends, are getting smarter, and they're learning how to defend against those tactics. But China has been very competitive, and China has been able to gain ground in both the East China Sea and the South China Sea, not just by building up a lot of forces and being there, although that's a big part of it, but also by playing a very competitive game.
Thank you so much. So sorry, my apologies. That was by Gen, not Jen. The next question is by Rob Mason. They ask, given the close cooperation you've noted between the JMSDF and the JCG, why don't the JMSDF do more to assist the JCG in preventing Chinese maritime incursion into the area around the Senkaku and the Dayo Islands?
That's a deliberate strategy. Japan wants to respond to the Chinese incursions with the right level of force. And the Japan Coast Guard has been capable of providing the right level of force. Right? The idea is to prevent China from gaining administrative control over those waters while minimizing the chances for escalation. So I think the idea is that China is sending fishing boats and Coast Guard, so you respond to those with Coast Guard. You don't up the ante by responding with the Navy. And in fact, the Coast Guard is quite capable of doing this. I mean, we don't need Aegis destroyers to push back Coast Guard vessels. It's a capability that is better used elsewhere.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Bradford. And thank you everyone for all of the wonderful questions. You have so many more questions about China, but of course, due to limited time, I just want to say thank you everyone for all of the awesome questions that you all asked today. With the last 3 minutes, I would like to talk about the upcoming events for YCAPS. So,
well, as she's calling those up, I just want to thank the audience. Really great questions. I tried to keep up with the chat while I was talking, and I was completely unable to. So that's maybe, I guess that demonstrates my weakness, but I'm hoping that demonstrates just how active you all are. We'd like to think that YCAPS isn't just a series of lectures, but it's really a place that we build community, even when it's a webinar. So very much appreciate the conversations, and I hope we can continue them in other venues. Amani, back to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Before I begin, I want to say thank you again, Mr. Bradford, for your presentation today and taking the time out of your evening to be with us. And once again, thank you to our program sponsors, the Japan Foundation New York. And lastly, like I mentioned, I will present about some upcoming events. So our next YCAPS Getting to Know Japan webinar will be on Perry's Black Ships and their influence on Japanese culture. This is next Tuesday, May 16th at 10 a.m. Captain Keizo Kitagawa will be speaking about this topic. Okay, well, my apologies for the technical issues, but the next event that we have for community conversations is on Thursday, May 18th. It is at 5:30 in person, and this is on the alliance politics in the age of great power rivalry and the implications for the US-Japan alliance. So this is an in-person event in Fusa. If you happen to be available, please join us for that. As usual, they will begin with refreshments, and then the seminar will be following that. The next Getting to Know Japan webinar will be on the Kaizoku in the Seito Inland Sea, and that will be on May 25th, Thursday, May 25th at 8 o'clock or 20. So please note that it's not on the at the average, the usual time, which is around 7. It will be at 8 o'clock instead. And this will be given by Professor Peter Shapinsky. So for all events in person and online, we ask that you kindly go to the YCAPS website, so ycaps.org, to register and to also find more information about these events. So once again, everyone, we thank you so much for joining us today. The upcoming event information will be in the chat. Mr. Bradford, once again, we thank you for speaking with us today, and we hope you all will join us next week for our next YCAPS event for Getting to Know Japan. So thank you so much and have an enjoyable rest of your evening. Bye.
Thank you so much. Those of you that have listened to one of our lectures with Captain Kitagawa know how great he is. So if you thought this was okay, come back because he's much better than me. Thanks.